Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more amazing HFY stories. Hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest uploads. The story opens on the alien world of Varnak, a harsh planet covered in vast deserts and strange, glowing fungi. The Tkairi, a powerful and ancient species of insectoid aliens, have long ruled the galaxy. Their queen Zarnathe is the center of their society, a being of immense power. Her survival depends on the sacred bond with a partner, but for centuries Tkairi law forbids bonding with anyone from another species. Enter Captain William Wilt Huxley, a human soldier who finds himself stranded on Varnak after a catastrophic mission. His crew has been lost, and the remnants of humanity's intergalactic fleet are desperately trying to escape the Tkairi's warpath. Will is captured by Tkairi forces while scouting for a way to get off the planet, and thrown into a prison beneath the Queen's palace. Unknown to Will, Zarnathe is struggling with her own mysterious ailment. Her heart, the symbolic and physical source of her power, is weakening, and the once proud Queen is slowly dying. Her healers have found that the only way to save her is through an ancient, forbidden bonding ritual with a being outside her species. The rituals say that only a human, someone with a heart capable of great love, can save her, but the risk of breaking Tkairi law could bring a death sentence for both. Will, still reeling from the death of his team, learns of Zarnathe's predicament when he is chosen by the Queen's advisors to participate in a secret ritual. What the Tkairi don't know is that Will is just the kind of man to defy the odds and bend the rules. But can he, a soldier hardened by war and loss, truly help save the alien queen, and is he willing to risk his life to do so? The chapter ends with a dramatic scene in which Will is brought before the queen. The atmosphere is tense as the two are locked in an intense gaze. Will has no idea how his life is about to change. Will stood in the grand chamber beneath the heart of the Tkairi palace, the air thick with tension and the heavy scent of alien flora that filled the air like a whisper of something older, something ancient. His eyes scanned the dimly lit room, taking in the towering walls adorned with alien murals depicting the history of the Tkairi, wars fought, victories claimed, empires built. It all felt so distant, so irrelevant now. The only thing that mattered was his survival and the mission he had been sent to complete. But none of it had gone according to plan. In front of him stood Zarnathe, the Tkairi queen. Even seated on her regal, throne-like dais, her presence was undeniable. She exuded an aura of authority and power, her 6 elongated limbs folded elegantly before her. Her insectoid face, though inscrutable, glowed faintly with the light from the strange crystalline formations embedded in her walls. Her translucent wings fluttered slightly, sending a shiver through the room as they caught the light, giving her an almost ethereal quality. Her amber eyes locked onto Will's, and for a moment, the weight of her gaze was suffocating. He tried not to let his fear show, but there was something in those eyes, something desperate, something foreign to him. Beneath the cold exterior, there was an unmistakable hint of vulnerability. Zarnathe was more than just a queen, she was a dying monarch. Will's heart pounded as the Tkairi healers, a cadre of soft-spoken, multi-limbed specialists, approached him. Their ritual garb shimmered in the dim light, their eyes focused and solemn. One of them, the leader, stepped forward and addressed him in halting, mechanical common. "Human," the healer said. "You have been chosen for the heart bond. You will be the salvation, or the end, of our queen." Will's chest tightened and he instinctively took a step back. "Heart bond?" he repeated, his voice hoarse. "You're saying I'm supposed to bond with her?" The very notion was absurd, and a shiver ran down his spine at the thought. This was a trap, wasn't it? The Tkairi were ruthless. There had to be some sort of trick. The healer's expression was unreadable, but there was an unmistakable seriousness in his eyes. "Yes. The heart bond is the ancient ritual that can save the queen's life. It is the only way for her heart to regain its strength. But it is forbidden. It has not been done in centuries." Will's thoughts raced, but he fought to keep his composure. If they had brought him here for some ritual, there had to be a catch. He glanced back at Zarnathe. Was she in on this? Was this a power play? Or was she really as desperate as they claimed? Zarnathe's voice broke through his internal turmoil. It was soft, almost gentle, but heavy with authority. "You are not the first human to be brought to this world," she said, her tone grave. "Your kind have crossed our path before. But you are the first to come at a time such as this. My heart is dying. The heart bond is my last hope." Will swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. The stories he had heard of the Tkairi, the warriors who could destroy entire fleets with a single command, were no exaggeration. They were ruthless, and their queen, Zarnathe, was the keystone of their power. But she was dying. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about survival, the survival of an entire species. For a long moment, Will remained silent. His mind raced. There were too many questions, too many unknowns. But the one thing that stood out to him was the desperate sincerity in Zarnave's voice. It was hard to reconcile that with the image of the cold, calculating ruler he had been briefed on. Could she really be as vulnerable as she seemed? And more importantly, could he trust her? Zarnave leaned forward slightly, her wings fluttering again. I know you do not understand. I know this is not what you expected. But you must help me, Captain Huxley. You are my only hope. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Captain Huxley. He wasn't just any prisoner. She knew who he was, his rank, his role. She had likely been watching him for days even before they had brought him here. He had to admit, the thought of being used as a pawn in a larger game of politics made his blood run cold. But there was something about her that disarmed him, an unmistakable sense of helplessness beneath the grandeur. The heart bond ritual was no simple matter. It required the willing participation of both the queen and her chosen partner, an intertwining of life forces through a shared connection. It was said to unite the two beings on a profound spiritual level. In return, the queen's heart would heal, her power restored. But it was a dangerous process. Could either save her, or kill them both. Will could feel the tension in the room. The air felt thick, charged with something he couldn't quite identify. The healers began to prepare the chamber, arranging strange devices that hummed with an eerie energy. Will was unsure whether he was more afraid of the alien technology or of what this bond could mean for him. Zarnave's eyes never left him, her voice quiet but insistent. Do you understand what is at stake, human? The heart bond will change everything. For both of us. For all of us. Will's throat went dry. He didn't know what to say. His mission had been clear, to scout the Tkairies' movements, to find a way to stop their war machine. But now, everything had shifted. This wasn't about tactics or strategy. It was about life and death. His decision would determine the fate of an entire species, and possibly his own. He took a deep breath. What if I refuse? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zarnave's gaze hardened. Then you will die here in this place. As will I. The gravity of her words hung in the air like a thunderstorm ready to break. Will knew this wasn't just a negotiation. This was a test, one he didn't know if he was ready for. But the alternative was even darker. Will closed his eyes for a moment, collecting his thoughts. Then, opening them, he looked directly into the queen's eyes and said, I'll do it. But if we're going to do this, I need to know everything. I need to know what I'm risking. Zarnave nodded once as if she had expected this. The ritual would begin soon and everything that followed would determine the future. The chamber had become an eerie stillness as the Tkairi healers moved around them. Strange instruments hummed softly, their alien mechanisms glowing with a light that seemed to pulse with life. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, and Will could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a sense that the very air was alive with the weight of destiny. He stood there in the heart of the Tkairi palace, trying to push down the fear that clawed at him. But there was no escaping it now. Zarnave's wings fluttered again, and for a fleeting moment, Will wondered if she was feeling the same unease. She was the queen, her power immense, her resolve unshakable. Or so it seemed. But as her amber eyes met his once more, he saw something he hadn't expected. A flicker of vulnerability, a quiet plea for help hidden beneath the regal facade. She wasn't just a ruler, she was a woman who feared for her life, willing to risk everything to survive. The healers began to chant in a language that Will didn't understand, their voices blending into a rhythmic, almost hypnotic drone. The words seemed ancient, older than time itself, and he felt the weight of their significance pressing down on him. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew it would change everything. Zarnave raised her arms in a slow, deliberate motion, and the room's dim lighting seemed to shift. A soft glow surrounded her, as if her body was emitting an energy of its own. The air became thick with the scent of the strange fungi that grew on the walls, their bioluminescent tendrils casting shadows that seemed to dance. Will could feel the queen's presence grow stronger, her power radiating outward, almost overwhelming him. It was as though the entire room had become a reflection of her will. She spoke again, her voice low and steady. Captain Huxley, this bond is not just of the body. It is of the soul. You will share my pain, my fears, my desires. And I yours. Only through this connection can we heal. Only through this union can my heart be restored. Will tried to steady his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. He had known this would be dangerous, but hearing her words brought the full weight of the situation crashing down on him. This wasn't just some ritual. It wasn't a simple exchange. They were about to bind their very lives together for better or worse. And there was no turning back. The Tkairi healer closest to him stepped forward, placing a glowing hand on Will's shoulder. The touch was cool and oddly comforting, and the healer's expression was one of quiet determination. Prepare yourself, human. You are about to share in the Queen's essence. The bond will take you to places you cannot yet imagine. The healer's voice was firm, but it carried an undertone of reverence, as though he was speaking of something sacred. Will could only nod, though his mind was a maelstrom of thoughts. What was he really getting himself into? He had no doubt the Tkairi were powerful, but this was something else entirely. A bond of the soul. How could he possibly understand what that meant? With a single motion, Zarna extended her hand toward him. Her long, delicate fingers glowed with the same ethereal light that surrounded her, a soft, pulsing aura that seemed to beckon him. Will hesitated, his mind racing. Was this the moment? Could he really go through with it? But the Queen's gaze held him steady. There was no time for second thoughts. He stepped forward. The moment his hand touched hers, a surge of energy rushed through him, and his world shattered into fragments. It was as though the fabric of reality had been torn apart. Will's senses exploded in a cacophony of sensations, flashes of light, blinding and impossible to comprehend, crashing waves of sound that rattled his bones, the weight of countless lifetimes pressing against his chest. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, a drumbeat that matched the pulse of the Queen's essence. He felt the Tkairi Queen's memories, her triumphs, her battles, her pain, flooding into him. He saw her rise to power, her empire expanding, her mind sharp and calculating, a ruler with no equal. But that wasn't all. There was something darker beneath the surface. A shadow of fear, of doubt, that haunted her every moment. Zarna was more than a queen. She was a woman burdened by the weight of her people's expectations, her duty to them overshadowing everything. Her strength had come at the cost of her own happiness, her own desires. And now her heart was failing, not just physically but emotionally. The Queen was dying because she had given everything for her people, and now there was nothing left. In an instant, Will was flooded with her emotions, her loneliness, her anger, and her desperation. He could feel her pain as though it were his own, could hear the silent scream of a soul in torment. It was unbearable. He fought against the torrent of emotions, but it was like trying to hold back an ocean with his bare hands. Then, just as quickly as the sensation had begun, it stopped. The room returned to focus, and Will found himself kneeling on the cold stone floor, gasping for breath. His head swam, his vision blurred. He was no longer alone. In the deepest part of his being, he felt Zarna's presence, felt the unbreakable bond that had been forged between them. It was a part of him now, inescapable. Zarna stood before him, her amber eyes glowing faintly. She too seemed to be recovering from the ordeal. The connection had been as overwhelming for her as it had been for him. The bond was not just physical, it was a meeting of their souls, a raw and intimate exchange of everything they were. Will could feel her thoughts, her fears, and the quiet strength that remained beneath the surface. Do you understand now? Zarna's voice was soft, but there was a new warmth to it, an unspoken gratitude. Will nodded, his breath still unsteady. I didn't know it would be like this. Her wings fluttered gently, a sign of relief. It never is. But you have done what no other has done. You have shared in my heart, Captain Huxley. And in return, I will share in yours. The bond was not yet fully formed, but Will could already feel its pull. His thoughts were no longer entirely his own. He could hear Zarna's heartbeat in his chest, could feel the flicker of her emotions like a fire warming him from the inside. They were now connected, their fates intertwined in a way he could never have predicted. But there was no time to dwell on the enormity of what had just happened. The healers were already gathering around them, their expressions grave. The moment of ritual had passed, and now it was time to see if the bond would heal the Queen, or if it would destroy them both. Will stood, his legs unsteady, and met Zarna's gaze once more. There was no turning back now. They were bound together, for better or for worse. And as the healers moved to begin their work, Will realized something. The true battle was just beginning. The chamber remained eerily silent after the ritual, the hum of the Tkairi healing devices now a distant, almost imperceptible noise. Will stood in the center, struggling to adjust to the overwhelming presence of the Queen in his mind. He could feel her, every emotion, every thought like a constant whisper at the edge of his consciousness. It was unsettling, invasive, and strangely intimate. The connection wasn't just one-sided. It was as if they were two halves of the same whole, locked together in a way neither of them fully understood. Zarna's amber eyes, still glowing faintly with the aftereffects of the ritual, flickered over him. There was no mistaking the depth of the bond now. Will could feel the faint tremor in her mind, the pulse of her weakening heart, the burden of her centuries-old legacy pressing down on her. You feel it, don't you? Zarnave's voice was soft, but the weight of her words carried an undeniable gravity. The bond is not just a link between our minds. It is a merging of our beings. Every emotion, every fear, every hope, now shared. Do not underestimate what this means, Captain Huxley. The power it gives you, and the power it takes. Will's pulse quickened. The words echoed in his mind, resonating with an unsettling truth. The bond was more than just a means of healing. It was a form of control, a silent pact that could not easily be broken. He could feel Zarnave's essence, her soul, wrapped around his own like a heavy cloak. Her thoughts had become his, and his had become hers. He could no longer distinguish where she ended and he began. I didn't ask for this, he muttered under his breath, his voice hoarse. I did not ask for it either, Zarnave responded, her tone barely above a whisper. But it is the only way to survive. The only way for me to heal. Her words had a bittersweet edge to them, and Will could feel the depth of the Queen's sorrow as if it were his own. The Tkairi were a race built on strength, on the power of the collective, yet here was their ruler, her heart failing, her power slipping away, and now she was vulnerable, as mortal as any human. Will could feel her thoughts shift, the emotional weight pressing down on him. Her isolation was suffocating, and it became clear to him that the Queen had never known true companionship. The Tkairi ruled through fear and force, and yet Zarnave had always been alone, a monarch with no equal, no peer, no one to share her burdens. That loneliness was something he could now feel intimately, like a sharp knife digging into his chest. How long do we have? Will asked, forcing his mind to focus on the present. There was no time for dwelling on the complexities of the bond, not yet, at least. Zarnave's wings fluttered lightly, a sign of frustration, and she closed her eyes for a moment as though gathering her thoughts. I do not know. The heart bond is the last hope of my people. Without it I will die, slowly, painfully. My heart is failing, and with it the strength of the Tkairi. I feel the pulse of the Empire weakening within me, just as I feel the pulse of your heart now. Will's head swam as the weight of her words settled deep in his bones. He could feel it now, too, the faint tremor in the connection that linked them. His heartbeat matched the rhythm of hers, like two drums beating in sync, and he wondered briefly what it would mean if that rhythm ever faltered. The Tkairi healers, who had been standing quietly in the shadows, began to move toward them once more, their expressions solemn. Their leader, a tall figure whose alien features were framed by a silvered cloak, stepped forward and addressed the Queen in their native tongue. Will couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakably grave. Zarnave listened for a moment, her gaze never leaving Will. When the healer finished speaking, she nodded slowly, and then turned her attention back to him. The ritual has begun, Captain Huxley. The bond is forming, but it is not yet complete. To restore my heart fully, we must reach the apex of this connection. But the price is high. The bond will take from you as much as it gives. Will didn't need to ask what she meant. His body felt different now, stronger yet weighed down by something intangible. His thoughts weren't entirely his own anymore. He could sense her memories, her feelings intertwining with his own, and every flicker of her pain seemed to ignite a corresponding pain in him. It was as though they were living the same life, experiencing the same sorrow and joy simultaneously. It was exhilarating and terrifying. He clenched his fists, trying to push through the disorienting surge of emotions, but Zarnave's presence in his mind was overwhelming. It was like a constant whisper at the edge of his thoughts, a voice that wasn't his own, but somehow felt like it was. He could feel her every worry, every fear, every doubt about the future. The weight of the Tkairi Empire, the survival of her species, it all rested on her shoulders. And now it rested on his as well. You must understand, Zarnave continued, her voice low, that in order for me to live, something within you will have to die. The heart bond is not without its sacrifices. To restore me you must give up a part of yourself. A part that may never return. Will stared at her, trying to process the enormity of what she was saying. He had known there would be a price to pay, but this was more than he had ever anticipated. His own life would change irrevocably, just as hers already had. The Queen's heart had been failing for so long, and now as they connected, it seemed that he, too, was becoming entwined with her fate. Would he even be able to survive this bond? And if he did, what would be left of him? The healers moved to Zarnave's side, preparing more of their strange instruments. Their hands glided over the Queen's body, each gesture seeming to carry the weight of an ancient ritual. Will could feel the pull of the bond growing stronger, like a powerful magnetic force drawing him closer to her. "You do not have to do this," Will said, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to sacrifice yourself. There must be another way." Zarnave's eyes softened, a flicker of something, almost human, passing over her otherwise stoic features. "There is no other way, Captain Huxley. The heart bond is the last chance we have. If I do not regain my strength, the Tkyri will fall. If I die, my people will perish with me. The sacrifice is not just mine. It is ours." Her words hit him like a slap, and for a moment, Will felt his heart tighten in his chest. The Tkyri were a species that had once conquered entire star systems, but now their survival hinged on the strength of a single bond, his bond with their queen. And if he failed? If he couldn't bear the weight of the connection? It would not just mean his death but the death of an entire species. For the first time since he had been captured, Will felt the crushing weight of responsibility settle fully upon him. There was no escape now. The bond had been formed, and now he would have to endure whatever came next, whether it healed the queen or destroyed them both. The healers continued their quiet work, weaving the intricate patterns of light and energy around Zarnave's frail body. Will could feel the strain in her mind, the flickering instability of her heart that seemed to reverberate with every beat of his own. They were locked in a rhythm that felt both unnatural and inevitable. The bond between them was growing, and with it, the force of their shared emotions was becoming more tangible, more real. Zarnave's body had always been strong, her Tkyri physiology a marvel of resilience, but now she seemed fragile, every breath a labor. The quiet hum of the healing instruments filled the room, the air thick with an unspoken sense of urgency. Will's thoughts swirled with doubt and fear. He could sense the depths of her struggle, the weight of responsibility that had crushed her for centuries, and now that burden was his as well. He glanced at her, his gaze lingering on the faint lines of strain etched across her regal features. Even in her weakened state, she still carried herself with the pride of a queen, her presence as commanding as ever. But inside Will knew she was unraveling. Her power was fading, her spirit fraying at the edges, and the only way to save her, to save them both, was to complete the bond. But he wasn't sure if he could. The cost was more than just physical, it was a tearing of their souls. "Will," Zarnave's voice broke through the silence, low and strained. She spoke his name as if it were the last lifeline she had left. He leaned closer to her, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm here. I'm with you." Her amber eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, he saw the true weight of the sacrifice in her gaze. There was no arrogance now, no mask of the untouchable queen. She was just a woman, a ruler, yes, but one who was terrified, vulnerable, and desperate. She wasn't asking him to save her out of some sense of duty or obligation. She was asking because there was no one else left to turn to. "You must be prepared for what comes next, Captain," Zarnave said softly, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic hum of the healing instruments. "The bond is not just a lifeline for me. It is a new life we will share, a life that will be both ours and not ours. Your body will change. Your mind will adapt. And there will be parts of you that will fade." Will's heart clenched at her words. The idea of losing parts of himself, parts he couldn't even name, was terrifying. But it was the price of survival. It was the price of their survival. "I don't know if I can do this," Will admitted, his voice raw with fear and uncertainty. He clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the power flowing through him, the currents of Zarnave's thoughts mixing with his own. "You must," Zarnave replied, her voice steady despite the cracks in it. "You are my only hope. Without you there is no way forward. Without you I will die and the Tkyri will fall." The words settled heavily in Will's chest. It was no longer just about saving her. He was now tethered to her fate, as impossible as that seemed. The fate of an entire species rested in their shared bond. He could feel the weight of their people's history in the back of his mind, an ancient and powerful force that seemed to stretch beyond time itself. The Tkyri had ruled the stars for millennia, but now they teetered on the edge of extinction. If Zarnave did not heal, if she did not regain her strength, the empire would crumble, and their legacy would be lost. He took a deep breath, the realization settling into his bones. There was no turning back. He had already made his choice when he'd accepted the Queen's bond. Now it was a question of endurance. The Tkyri healer leader moved to Zarnave's side, his long, skeletal hands hovering over the Queen's chest, glowing tendrils of energy extending from his fingertips. Will could feel the resonance of the energy, a silent pulse that matched his own heartbeat. The bond was intensifying, becoming stronger, deeper. He was no longer merely a spectator. He was part of it, part of something far greater than himself. Zarnathe's wings fluttered weakly, her breathing shallow. She was sinking further into the depths of her condition, and Will could feel her slipping away. His pulse quickened, and in that moment he realized something terrifying. If she died, the bond would not merely dissolve. It would kill him too. The very life force that now sustained them both would be torn apart, and there would be no surviving that. Will, the Queen's voice was barely a whisper now. You must fight. Do not let go. He nodded, though the words caught in his throat. He wanted to fight, to be the hero, to save her and the Tkairi, but the weight of the bond was suffocating. He could feel Zarnathe's despair pressing against him like a crushing force, and the longer it went on, the harder it became to distinguish where her emotions ended and his began. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a vessel for their survival. And every second that passed felt like a lifetime. The healer leader extended his hands, his glowing tendrils curling toward Zarnathe's chest. The energy in the room shifted, becoming electric, crackling with the intensity of their efforts. Will could feel the tide of power rising, threatening to engulf them both. It was as if the very fabric of their reality was trembling beneath the force of the connection. The bond was reaching its critical juncture. It was now or never. I am ready, Zarnathe whispered, her breath shaky but filled with resolve. We must push through. The Tkairi, our people, depend on this. The healer began his incantations, words that echoed through the chamber, ancient and unfamiliar. Will could feel the power surging, the bond tightening around them, squeezing his soul like a vice. The world around him blurred, and his vision swam as Zarnathe's consciousness merged deeper with his own. He could feel her in every cell of his body, her memories flooding his mind. But now it was not just the past that enveloped him. It was her hopes, her dreams, her deepest fears for her people. For a moment, he felt the weight of the empire, the endless responsibility that had shaped her into the queen she was. She had lived for centuries, fought for every inch of her people's survival, and now, it was all coming to a head. The bond would either save her or destroy them both. Will closed his eyes, focusing on the connection, on the rhythm of their hearts. He could hear the whisper of her thoughts, the pulse of her soul, and he knew what he had to do. He had to hold on. He had to fight for them both, even if it meant losing himself in the process. For the queen. For the Tkairi. For humanity. And then the world went dark. When he opened his eyes again, everything was still. The stillness was suffocating. Will's mind felt heavy as if it were submerged in water, pressing down on him from all sides. The faint echoes of Zarnathe's thoughts still lingered in the dark recesses of his mind, but they were distant, like a whisper carried on a breeze that had long passed. He couldn't tell if he had been unconscious for moments or days. The last thing he remembered was the overwhelming surge of power, the intensity of the bond that had stretched them both to the brink of destruction. But now there was nothing but a profound silence. Slowly he opened his eyes, his vision blurry as though his body was still adjusting to the change. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the Tkairi healing devices. His body felt different, heavier but also lighter, as though the weight of the bond had shifted into something new. There was a strange sense of clarity in his mind, but it wasn't his own clarity. It was Zarnathe's. Her thoughts, once a chaotic whirlwind, now settled into his mind like an old friend. He could feel her. Her presence was not as suffocating as before, but it was unmistakably there, intertwining with his own consciousness in a way he could not fully explain. Zarna? He whispered, his voice hoarse as though he had not spoken in years. A faint hum filled the air, and then a voice answered him, one that was both foreign and intimately familiar. I am here, Captain Huxley. Will sat up slowly, his mind still clouded by the lingering effects of the ritual. The Queen's presence was no longer the desperate, fragile being she had been. Her voice was strong now, filled with the authority and poise that had once commanded entire star systems. But it was different. It was no longer the voice of a queen who stood alone. It was the voice of a queen who had finally found a partner, someone who would stand with her, not just for her. He glanced down at his hands, his fingers trembling. There was a part of him that feared what he might see, what he might feel. He didn't know what the bond had done to him. What parts of himself had he lost? What parts of Zarnathe had he taken on? But as he focused on the sensation of the bond, he realized something extraordinary. He could still feel himself. He was still Will Huxley, the man who had fought for humanity's survival, who had stood against countless enemies, who had tried to maintain his own identity even in the face of overwhelming odds. But now there was something else, a thread of Zarnathe's essence woven into his being. It wasn't a loss of himself, but rather an expansion. He had become more than human, more than just the sum of his experiences. He was part of something greater now, and he could feel it in his blood, in his soul. The queen's wings, now fully restored, stretched out beside her, their ethereal glow casting faint shadows across the room. She was standing, her posture regal as always, but now there was a sense of unity in her stance. She no longer bore the weight of her empire alone. She and Will, together, were the pillars on which the future of the Tkairi would be built. "How do you feel?" Zarnathe's voice was filled with a quiet concern, but also a sense of peace that had been absent before. Will blinked, feeling the flood of emotions that were not just his own. There was a warmth, an undeniable connection that tethered him to her, and in that moment he truly knew, that the queen's heart was no longer failing. She had healed not just in body but in spirit. And so had he. "I feel whole," he replied, his voice steady now, the tremor of uncertainty from before replaced by a newfound certainty. He looked at her, meeting her amber eyes. There was no mistaking the understanding between them. It was as though they had always known each other, always shared this bond, and now they had merely awakened to it. "I feel like I've become part of something bigger than myself." Zarnathe's lips curled into the smallest of smiles, a fleeting expression of gratitude. "You have. And in doing so you have saved more than just my life. You have saved my people." The weight of her words hung in the air between them, but it wasn't a burden. It was a promise, a vow that they would face whatever challenges came next, not as ruler and soldier but as something more. Something inseparable. The Tkairi healers had gathered around the two of them, their eyes wide with awe and respect. They could sense the change in the air, the powerful shift that had occurred within the queen and the human who now stood beside her. For the first time in what felt like centuries, the healers saw hope in their queen's eyes, and it was a hope that extended beyond the confines of their species. Will felt the queen's thoughts align with his, a shared understanding of what lay ahead. Together they would face the challenges that came with the newly formed bond. The Tkairi were no longer alone in their struggle to survive. Humanity, had become a part of their fight, and they would become a part of his. They would forge a new future, one that bridged the gap between their worlds, between their species. "There is still much to do," Will said, standing on unsteady legs. "We've survived the ritual, but the war is far from over. The Tkairi are still vulnerable. We need to prepare." Zarnathe's expression shifted, and for the first time she seemed truly alive, not just physically but in every sense. She wasn't the broken queen who had sought a way out. She was the queen who had found a way forward. "Yes, we have much to do. But now we do it together." As the Tkairi healers began their quiet work around them, preparing the queen for her next steps, Will felt a new sense of purpose swelling within him. The bond was not just a means of survival. It was a partnership, one that would shape the future of both their peoples. He turned to Zarna, his mind and heart still entwined with hers. "We've created something that neither of us could have done alone," he said. "But together we can build something that will endure." The queen's gaze softened, and she nodded, the weight of her centuries-old crown no longer pressing down on her. Instead, there was a lightness in her eyes, a spark of something powerful and eternal. "For the Tkairi. For humanity. For the future," she said, and with those words, Will knew the truth of their bond. It wasn't just a connection between two individuals. It was the beginning of something greater. Something unstoppable. Together they would face the coming storm. Together they would be ready. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.